Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. I'm Mike Stanley. I'm the fire chief of the Oshkosh Fire Department and also the vice president of the Great Lakes Division of the IAFC. I'm very excited to be back with you again for one of our quarterly webinars that have a topic today that I think will be very relevant to everybody that's listening now or in the future. Today, we're going to talk about a different way of preparing people for promotion by focusing on character. I know for me, and I'm sure many of my colleagues that are on the call here listening today know that always a struggle to try to find the best and the brightest and put them into those leadership and supervisory management type of positions. So today this will be recorded. That if you're having so that people can enjoy it later. But if you're having any technical difficulties, there's some information here about how you can help to get those resolved. Or, please just put something in the chat or the FAQs, and we'll try to get you some help. So we encourage discussion. That Nan from the IAFC will be helping me to monitor the chat and the QAs. That is, as we're having some dialogue today, truly we want it to be dialogue. If you have questions or observations or things you want to explore more, this is really about how we add value to each and every one of you. And best utilize your time. So like I said, we encourage you to engage in some discussion with us. And so we'll be watching that. Lots of other upcoming events put on by the International Association of Fire Chiefs. Great chances for us to expand our learning and our knowledge and to go out and network with people around the country. So I encourage you to look at any of these opportunities and hope to see you able to participate in some of these events. Now, with no further ado, I'd like to introduce Dave Anderson. That he is the author of Becoming a Leader of Character, which is what qualifies him today to talk about how do we look at defining character in our promotional processes. And he also has an outstanding program about how we become a firefighter of character that he goes around the country presenting. And he's been a multiple-time presenter at FRI. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to give this presentation at FRI because of an injury, but I'll let him explain a little bit more about that. But I'd like to welcome Dave to the discussion.
Well, thanks, Chief. I appreciate you, and I appreciate bringing up the reason why I wasn't at FRI this year. 14 screws and 3 plates in my foot prevented me the week before FRI, prevented me from being there. So I'm glad I get a chance to share the message today.
Great. Well, I'm glad you're on the mend from that, and look forward to our discussion today because, I touched on it a little bit earlier of how difficult it is, to conduct a promotional process. We're all looking for the perfect promotional process because we want to find not only the best supervisors and managers for our organization, but really we need leaders, to advance our departments and advance the fire service. We need to succession plan, get leaders in the right positions to help us move our departments. In your book, Becoming a Leader of Character, you talk about how many leadership failures are in direct relation to character errors or character mistakes. Or character failures, excuse me. So how do we weave this into our promotional process? Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I think, Chief, I think one of the things that we need to think about is the fact when most of us think about leaders that we know of who have failed, whether or not it's somebody from history, whether or not it's somebody from TV or wherever it is, or maybe somebody we knew personally, and we look at the reasons why they failed, they rarely failed because of a competency issue. I define competency as knowing what to do and how to do it. But they rarely failed because they didn't know what to do or how to do it. They failed because at the moment of testing, when they had a choice between the harder right and the easier wrong, their character failed them and they chose the easier wrong. Yet, what do we do as we're developing people? What do we train people on? What are we testing on when we get into these promotional processes? Lots of times in the fire services, we're looking for somebody who knows how to run a fire. But what gets people in trouble is the other stuff, the stuff that happens at the firehouse, the conversations that aren't controlled around the kitchen table. The things that happen that cause the issues have nothing to do with tactical competencies. They have to do with a character issue. And when you look at the things that fire departments across the country are paying things out, insurance companies are the payouts. Where do they come from? The payouts aren't coming because somebody screwed up something tactically at an incident, right? The tactical commander didn't screw something up because there. What happens is that same person who can run a damn good fire shows up back at the firehouse, and their character fails them at the moment of testing. And that's when those insurance companies are paying out millions and millions of dollars for something that happens back at the station house. And so what I always try to impress upon the leadership in the fire services and in law enforcement, because I do a lot of work with them as well, is we can't just hope our people make wise decisions when their character is tested. Hope is a great thing to have, but it's a terrible leadership strategy. We need to prepare them for those decisions. We need to train them on those decisions. And when you think about it, the stuff we train on, the stuff the fire services train on, all the tactical stuff that you spend all these hours upon hours upon hours training on, people aren't screwing up. But the stuff that we don't train on, we don't focus on, guess where the screw ups are? Character, right? And so that's the approach I'm advocating for right now.
Thanks, Dave. That's awesome. And, certainly in my own experiences throughout my fire service career, and every day it seems like when, you go to firehouse.com or firerescue1.com or, any of the e-zines and trade journals, we don't really see so much, like you said, about people made bad strategical, tactical task decisions. We see the big oopses that make the front page. Those are the ones that are those character decisions. And I know you're spending a lot of time around the country having these discussions with fire departments. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Of what are you seeing specifically?
Yeah.
And before you do that, just want to shout out. I'm looking at the chat room, and great representation from the Great Lakes area. But thank you for all of you around the country that have jumped on here. I'd love to see people from all over our United States, and hopefully we'll see some from around the world that are tuned in to learn more about this. So go ahead, Dave.
Yeah, speaking of being all around the United States, I was just up in your neck of the woods last week, actually not working with fire departments, even though the Madison Fire Department took good care of my son and I as we were at the Wisconsin and Alabama football game. And I want to do a shout out to Station 4 right beside the stadium, who took care of us there. But and I'm heading to Long Beach actually for work, to work with the Long Beach Fire Department here, starting at the second half of this week and into next week, doing some work there. But it's not different. It's not different from one state to another. When I talk to leaders all the time, and when I talk to where the headaches come from, and when I speak across the country, again, it's like I said, these aren't tactical issues. The issues that are causing the problems all have to do with the choices people make at the moment they're tested. And when we talk about character, we talk about our character being like a muscle. The more you exercise it, the stronger it gets. And, too often, and when we're talking about promotional processes, we're going to hand somebody a book. I mean, like I've got our book right here, Becoming a Leader of Character. We can hand somebody a book and then make them take a test on it. But that doesn't mean it's been internalized. They just read a book, and then maybe they're a good test taker. What do they do? What actual choices do they make? We talk about you have to do what you want to be. And so what are people actually doing on a day-to-day basis, and how do the choices they make form their habits? And each time you make a choice, it makes it easier to make that same choice again and again and again. And so as we're developing people and as they're growing in our agencies, and we start scanning the horizon for the next set of leaders that we want to promote, we need to be focusing on not just their tactical competence, but also on who they are, their character. What do they regularly do? What choices do they regularly make when it comes to character? Because whatever choices they regularly make now are probably going to be the same choices they're going to make when they get another bugle.
Awesome. So to back up just a little bit, that I noticed some pictures of you in bunker gear on your first slide. Can you tell us a little bit about who the heck are you? Have you been a firefighter, or what's your background? And throughout your journey, what lessons have you learned about how to promote people into the right leadership spots?
Yeah. Well, I'll give you hopefully the Reader's Digest condensed version here. I am the son of an Army general. My father went to West Point, and I went to West Point. He did 42 years active duty in the Army. I did 4, so I was on the other end of the spectrum. But I got out of the Army after Operation Desert Storm, and I spent 20 years in corporate America. And then in 2012, I left that role in corporate America and started my own company doing leadership training and development. And in 2016, my father and I wrote this book together, Becoming a Leader of Character, which we referenced already. And when that happened, a friend of mine I went to West Point with, who is actually in law enforcement, is a SWAT lieutenant in the Dallas area. He called me up and he said, Dave, we've got nothing in any of our leadership curriculum that approaches leadership from a character aspect. You should develop something for law enforcement. And in 2017, we started doing that. And we've been working with law enforcement ever since then. But then about 3 years ago, I got a call from the Front Range Fire Consortium, which is in north of Denver, Colorado, 11, 12 agencies there. And they were asking for 25 signed copies of our book. And I said, well, sure, of course, happy to send those your way. What are you using them for? And they said, well, we're using them for our Battalion Chiefs Academy. And I said, well, we've got a curriculum for law enforcement based on this book. And they asked me, they said, well, can you adapt it to fire? And I said, no, I can't adapt it to fire. We can adapt it to fire because I don't know enough about the fire services right now to be able to speak wisely to the men and women who serve in the fire services. So what they did, they invited me up to Colorado, and those pictures that you saw there were me going through some training with them. And I've trained with a few other agencies since then. And I learned a lot of lessons while I was up there. And one of them was now I'm 58. I'm not as in good a shape as I thought I was because I was sucking wind carrying around those 60 pounds of equipment all over the place, especially up in altitude. But I've spent a lot of time working with fire and rescue, spent a lot of time interviewing people in the fire services, preparing and understanding the lifestyle and, going out on calls and things. And so it's been a great experience for me doing that. And, and I'm sorry, I've forgotten what your follow-on question was to that.
How do those experiences that you had in the military and in the private sector, I'm guessing you had some supervisory capacity in those jobs, and you were responsible for promoting people, and selecting people to be leaders and managers and supervisors and administrators, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
What did you learn? What pearls did you learn from those experiences that you could give us here in the fire service?
Yeah, I think, I mentioned 20 years in corporate world. 15 of those years I was in leadership positions where I was interviewing and promoting people. And I didn't always get it right. I mean, there were people I promoted that I look back on and, I missed. They were a swing and a miss. And what did they have in common? And I watched other people promote, and I was involved in promotion processes in different parts of the company, helping out with that. And where did the swing and the misses happen? It all happened around the issue of character, right? We were promoting people who were really good in their previous job, right? And very competent people. And then when they would get into leadership, they would screw up. They'd make a poor choice. They'd make comments. They'd cut corners. They'd do things like that. Or they wouldn't coach up a former peer or correct a former peer. And it blew up in their face. And I recognize the fact that, there's one of my good friends in fire services. He is the director of the Division of Fire Protection and Control in the state of Colorado. His name is Mike Morgan. And I love a statement that he uses, and I've stolen it from him. And so, Mike, if you're listening to this, I'm going to use your words again here. You hire for the heart and you train the hands. And as leaders, as we're looking to develop leaders, it's the same principle. If you think about the great coaches in sports, they weren't necessarily the greatest players on their teams when they were actually actively playing the game. But what they were, what they are these leaders inside. They were leaders then, and they're leaders at the top of the game when they are the managers or the coaches. So who's leading wherever they are before? And who are going to be the ones that we can predict to be the best leaders once they actually get the stripes or get the bugles put on them. And people used to ask me in the corporate world, Dave, how do I get to the next level? What do I need to do to be doing your job? And I said, well, there's two things. I said, A, you need to master the job that you're in, be the best at that. And then B, lead where you are. And if somebody's not leading, even though they don't have the title, even though they don't have that promotion yet, if they're not a leader already, why would we expect them to suddenly start leading later? I'm looking for those same principles. I'm looking for those same habits of character that we talk about. What are they doing before they actually get the title of leader? And if they aren't leading before, I doubt they're going to lead later. Mike, I don't hear.
A sideways right turn.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you there for a second, Mike.
That I want to circle back to your military experience.
Yeah.
But I want to take you on a sideways right turn real quick. We got a great question from Joe. That you talked about you need character, and you need to have the heart in the right place, and you need to be leading beforehand. I think those are all excellent observations. Mm-hmm. But question Joe brings up, which I think is probably relevant to a lot of people across the country, is how do we get our leaders to balance family, work, emergency response, training, all these competing forces that he says we seem to be suffering with that currently, and it's making it difficult to keep newer members interested if the leaders aren't there. So how do we, even though their heart's in the right place and we've taught them the hands things like you've said, how do we help support them in balancing all those competing interests and being pulled in so many different directions?
Yeah, I'm listening to that question, and one of the things I've recognized about the fire service is that really you guys have an incredible advantage that most organizations don't, is the fact that, like the military, you guys live together. And I say guys in a broad term. Down here in Texas, we'll say y'all. Y'all live together, right? And you eat all your meals together when you're on duty. And what an incredible opportunity around the kitchen table, just like families have these opportunities to talk about these issues of character that that face us. And yeah, and I hear what Joe's saying about all these competing things that are going on and all these other things that demand time. But there's always that moment where everybody is together around that kitchen table in the firehouse. And this is the opportunity for a 10-minute discussion. Just imagine a shift starting every day with a 10-minute discussion around the kitchen table or around a meal, where we're talking about one of the 6 habits of character. We talk about courage, humility, integrity, selflessness, duty, positivity. And what if these conversations were happening on a regular basis around that kitchen table? It's not an add-on training event. What I always say, training is an event and development is a process. And the leaders on the ground, whether or not from the company officers on up, have this opportunity where to develop their people and not just send them off to training run by guys like me, but to actually develop them throughout the process of the time that you already are together. The demands on the time that you have in the fire services are incredible. I mean, people pulling you in all different directions. But I would always say, the legacy. I challenge fire chiefs all the time. I remind them, I'm like, look, nobody your last day at work, the day you retire, nobody's going to walk up to you and say, hey, chief, remember policy 29-4B? Man, that was the best day of my career when you rolled that thing out. Right? It's not the policies that people are going to respond to and remember about us when we're done. It's our impact on their lives. And how do we help them reach their goals and become the best version of themselves that they can be? That's where we come in as leaders, and that development process that can happen while we're living life together, while we're doing life together in the firehouse. And so that's what I like to stress about this. It's not an add-on, it's part of our day.
I think that's a fantastic observation, and very impactful advice about what you just said about the policies. What is our legacy going to be? Because all of us as fire chiefs or chief officers, leaders, we want to have that legacy. But with the fire service, it is so policy and procedure driven. And we tout ourselves as a paramilitary organization. And I, for one, say I belong to a paramilitary organization, but I've never been in the military.
Yeah.
You have the advantage of having that experience in the military and that education through West Point. What are your thoughts on how we fit into that?
Yeah, there's I hear it again. I heard it in law enforcement and I heard it in fire. And honestly, law enforcement feels like they're paramilitary. Fire feels like they're paramilitary. I will actually say, now that I've worked as much with fire services as I have, I'd say even fire is even more like the military because of that living together, training together, eating together type family atmosphere that is in that situation, because you are always around each other. Where law enforcement go out and they go out by themselves, they might converge on a scene and then they go out by themselves again, where you guys are always together. But one of the ways I will say is different in the between the military and the fire services, back to the fire service specifically, is the fact that in the military, the only person not responsible for developing somebody is the private straight out of basic training. After that, the private first class is responsible for developing the private, the corporal, for the private first class, the sergeant for the corporal, all the way up to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Everybody in the chain of command, except for that lowest level person straight out of boot camp, is responsible for developing people. That's not necessarily the case in fire services. There are, I'm not saying people aren't developing people in the fire services. I'm just saying it's not part of the culture like it is in the military. And so many of the, and again, going back to Joe's question or thoughts about the time involved, right? Do we have time for this type of thing? It's a very, it's a very interesting thing that, what if everybody had that mindset that, if I was a firefighter and some probationary firefighter just came out of the academy, and I knew I was responsible for developing that person, and not just sitting back going, gee, I wonder what the captain's going to do about this new guy, right? But I'm responsible for him. And then I got a driver responsible for the firefighter, getting that firefighter ready to be a driver. And then I've got a company officer getting that driver ready to be a company officer all the way up. It'd be interesting to see how that would change the legacy and how the culture of an organization in a fire department could be impacted by the idea that everybody's searching around saying, this guy's my responsibility. She's my responsibility. I need to get her ready for her next promotion. That's my job.
I love it. And you referenced Joe's question. I want to circle back around a little bit to that too, and how some of this coaching and mentoring, your discussion, that ownership may apply, because as you know, Dave, there's so many different models for the fire service across the country. And when you answered the question earlier, we talked about, I've got a captive audience. I get them at lunch every day. I'm going to sit down with them in my station, or, we're going to have formal training opportunities. But, as we look at different models that have combination departments of, part-time people or volunteers, that, I don't have them with that degree of frequency. My touch points as a chief may go way down. How do I maximize on that opportunity? And it's not to discount the importance of the mealtime, because, certainly in a career department, that is huge. But for our folks on the call that are have different models, what are some suggestions you may have for them?
Yeah, I'd say there's one big word, and it's intentionality, right? Nobody ever drifts their way into excellence in anything. You have to be intentional. Whether or not it's physical fitness, whether or not it is academic excellence, whatever it is, whatever any listener here is excellent at doing, you didn't just kind of drift into it. You made some specific plans, and you were intentional about becoming excellent in that. And so if we want to be excellent at developing the people and preparing them for the next level, we can't just kind of let it happen. We have to have a plan and formulate that plan around that. So I think that's one of the biggest issues I see is there's a lot of good intentions out there of leaders to develop the next generation, but intentions aren't enough. We need to actually have actual plans and think through what is a model that works. And, the model that I propose, and it's worked for over 200 years, is the model used at West Point around character development. See, if you read our book, Becoming a Leader of Character, we say leadership starts with our thoughts. I mean, the character starts with our thoughts. What do we think about? What do we fill our heads with? Right? But just knowledge, just putting things into our head isn't enough. See, the more we think about something, the more it impacts our words. And so the more we talk about something, the more it impacts our actions. So as we talk and speak about things, it impacts the choices that we make, as we already talked about choices. And then each time we make a choice, it makes it easier to make that same choice again, and it forms a habit. And that's good habits and bad habits are formed the same way, each one choice at a time. And then that's how we form those habits, and our habits form our character. How we are on a habitual basis is who we are. So at West Point, what they used was they didn't just hand us, for instance, the honor code, which said a cadet will not lie, cheat, or steal, nor tolerate those who do, and said, okay, now go out and be honorable and have integrity. We went through an education process. We sat down every week and we had a honor class where we talked about scenarios. What would happen for instance, a young kid, if your roommate pulled out an fake ID at a bar when you're on weekend leave, what do you do? Right? These weren't these easy layup questions. These were difficult questions, which was, what do you do? Do you have that hard conversation with your buddy? Do you turn them in? Because it says, well, a cadet will not lie, cheat, or steal, nor tolerate those who do. So if you don't, at West Point, if you didn't report that fake ID, even though he was off duty, if you didn't report that integrity breach, you were likely to get in just as much trouble as a person who had the fake ID. A 19-year-old kid talking about that stuff, those are some interesting learning points. And it's the same principle that I want to present that, and I do present to organizations all over the country when I'm talking about this stuff, is we've got to set up and have these conversations so that the first time when somebody is faced with a character test, it's not that critical moment. They're faced with it in that safe environment where it's a group of peers led by maybe another peer, but maybe led by a company officer or even a driver, a battalion chief. And we're talking about, so what would happen if, a huge, a very common issue in the fire services is, hey, you just got promoted. And now you just, somebody who 2 weeks ago was your peer, you just watched them pencil whip a rig check. Now, you're supposed to do something about it, but this is your friend. 2 weeks ago, you were right there beside him, and maybe you would have let it slide then. So now all of a sudden you got the bugle on and you're going to correct him. What do we do in that situation? Well, let's not hope somebody makes the right decision at that moment. Let's prepare them by having these conversations on a regular basis. And if I'm in a volunteer fire department, I'm finding those moments and those times, and I'm being intentional with some of these scenarios, and I'm having these conversations in a formal and or informal environment. So the more we talk about it, the more it impacts people's actions.
I think that's a great segue into an excellent question we have here from Ian, that, talked about the intentionality, and the preparing prior to the promotional process. But, as we get into that promotional process, how do we assess leadership? What are your recommendations about that? Because, I've heard that, I always like the quote, leadership is like beauty. I know it when I see it. But when it comes time to assess and score leadership in these assessment centers or whatever type of promotional process we might be using, how do you do that? How do you do that in a promotional setting? Is it more scenario based, like what you were talking about from West Point, with that example about the fake ID, or is it something, based on the history of the person, something that we've seen them do, or we think they've done? Tell me more.
Well, I was very blessed in the corporate world, because in the military, I didn't have any role in whether or not somebody gets promoted or not. That's done at a different level. But in the corporate world, as you're promoting people and you're interviewing them and things, I learned a lot of things. And one of the things I do know is, whether or not you're in the fire services, corporate world, wherever you are, very few people have ever been trained to interview. If you think about it, how many, everybody listening out there, raise your hand if anybody ever trained you how to interview somebody for a promotion. There's probably very few raising their hand right now. See, you know what that tells me? That means that most people who interview people are interviewing the way they were interviewed in the past. So whatever I know about interviewing, I learned from the people who interviewed me. And so if you think about that, that means probably in the interview process is a lot like it's always been. It hasn't changed. And the problem is, what we do is, when we look at these interview processes, maybe we have books that we tell people to read, and we say, well, if they know the information in this book and they take a test on it and they pass the test, well, they're the best choice for a leader. But we've all seen that blow up on us, haven't we? Just because somebody can take a test doesn't mean they're going to be the best leader in the group. Sometimes we do these assessment centers where there are these questions about what would you do if, and I think those are a step forward. They really are. But one of the things I really learned in my time in corporate America was, I don't want people who know the right answers. The whole point behind the whole interview process and the selection process is not to figure out whether or not people know the right answers. It's to figure out who people are. Because if I can figure out who that person is, like Mike Morgan says, we can train the hands. We can train somebody to run a fire. We can train somebody to know how to do all the admin work that goes along with being a battalion chief. We can train all that. What we need to know is who that person is and how do they actually behave. And so our interviews can't be about philosophy. Oh, what's your philosophy of leadership? See, philosophical questions don't give us any information about that person. That just tells us what was the last book they read, right? And if we're already asking them to read books, and then they do, and they just spout off the stuff that they read in their book, does that actually mean that that's who they're going to be at the moment of testing? Or what have we seen in the past from them in smaller microcosms of situations? And and we need to ask about those situations that they've been in the past, and structure our interviews around, what did you do in the past? Because whatever somebody did in the past is the best predictor of what they're going to do in the future. So they might be smaller leadership challenges that they met because they were at a different rank, but it's going to be a good predictor of what they're going to do as they grow in the organization. And so the questions that we ask and the answers that we're looking for, there's some structural things that we need to do. But I truly believe that just asking those philosophical questions are not going to be is not enough. It doesn't tell us enough about a person. It just tells us whether or not their philosophy honestly agrees with my philosophy.
I think that's a great answer to Ian's question, Dave. And as I was listening to you, I was thinking about something I want you to dive into a little bit more for us, because and you've touched on it a lot, given us a lot of great pearls about the intentionality and the building of the culture, and what the 6 different pillars and character are, and all the things you've shared with us so far. But as I'm thinking about promotional processes, a lot of us may have very little control about the process. That it might be run by an outside organization, a consultant, might be an HR department, or it might be, based purely on promotion, might be based on a vote, for many departments as well. Mm-hmm. So, as a chief officer, how do we help to inculcate this culturally more and more? Like I said, you've talked a little bit about, how we do that, with mentoring and coaching. But tell me how I can shape and guide that process, mm-hmm. that outcome of finding that best leader with character, when I don't control the process for promotion as much as I might like to.
Yeah, I guess as an old Army guy, I'm unfortunately going to use a naval analogy, which says a high tide raises all buoys, right? If you are in that situation where you don't have the control over the actual process and the details of how a promotion is, how you go about promoting people, then I would be focusing on the culture of my organization and be making sure that, all right, across the board, if we are always talking about character, and if character is in our DNA, right? Some people use the word culture. I actually call it organizational character. Organization's character is its demonstrated values, not the values we claim to have, not the values we have on our challenge coin or on our shields, but actually how do people actually behave? And that is a leader's moral obligation, is to steer that ship into port, right? See, a ship left adrift rarely ends up in port. It almost always ends up on the reef. And as leaders, in the role that you're describing, Mike, is, we have to be at the helm of that ship and steering that culture. So, the 6 habits of character, again, that we talk about are courage, humility, integrity, selflessness, duty, positivity, people's attitudes. What are we doing as leaders to make sure that that is the expectation for everybody at every rank in our organization? How do we continue to keep those values alive, so when somebody isn't living up to those values, it's not just something that comes out in an interview process, in a promotion process. It comes out to everybody in the firehouse. Everybody can see when remember Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh, right? I can't believe they're making us change the hose plan again. I like the old way we loaded the hose instead of this way. This doesn't make any sense, right? Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh, right? When somebody starts acting like Eeyore, it's not just like, oh, it's just Dave. Look at him. That's just who he is. No, people are starting to say, see, this guy's not living up to who we are in this agency. or in this firehouse or on this and in this engine company, right? He's not one of us. He's not being who he needs to be. And so now we start self-correcting and correcting each other from the inside. Again, that high tide raising all buoys. I guess I've used 2 naval analogies now, but that high tide raising all buoys. If we're always talking about character, and character is the conversation that comes around whenever we're developing people, whenever we're correcting behaviors, whenever we're looking for promotable people, it's going to be obvious who the high character, the leaders of character are, no matter what their rank is, because everybody understands what the standard is for character, because the leadership talks about it all the time. What I see lots of times in organizations is leaders say, oh, we want high character people, but they only talk about it every once in a while. And if you only talk about it once in a while, people don't think it's important. The more you talk about something, the more it adds importance to it. And so as leaders in that, trying to develop that culture or that organizational character, we've got to be intentional about our conversations around character and build an organization that is consistently going back to these ideas of what character is. And that means who we are and who do we want leading us in the future.
Yeah, so you really got me thinking here, Dave, and I'm sure everybody that's listening as well. Then I told you I'm not going to throw you any curveballs, and then I'm going to turn around and maybe throw you a couple curveballs.
That's all right.
Yeah, I know you're well equipped to answer them. That it's kind of this next step in our discussion.
Yeah.
That many of us, maybe we inherited the fire department, or maybe we missed and promoted somebody without as much character as we want. Whatever that scenario might be. But you talked about. I love your points about. Yesterday I was a peer, now I'm the boss.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody's going to challenge us with an oops, a character mistake. Even all the way up to the role of fire chief of, oh no, you just made that, critical flaw, critical character error that, is going to be high profile. So kind of a 2-part question for you, and maybe even 3 parts, so for that new leader, how do they, what's some advice on how they address that character flaw? I saw somebody pencil whipping that report. How do I address that? As their supervisors and leaders, like I said, whether it be a battalion chief, assistant chief, fire chief, whatever, how do we support them, to further reinforce that cultural mores that you were talking about? And then when you talked about organizational character, when we get a blemish, we get a high profile thing that makes us look bad, how do we as a chief address that with the membership and the public? Yeah. So I know it's about a 20-part question, but
I see 3 tiers here in this question. The first thing is really one of the most common things that I run into, whether or not when I'm working with promotable leaders, people who are just getting into that company officer level, and they're seeing that, or maybe even battalion chief level, where I'm about ready to make a correction on somebody, and actually they know I used to do the same thing, right? I used to cut the same corner, and they know that as well. So what do I do then? Well, some people say, well, Dave, I don't want to be a hypocrite. I'm like, well, part of being a leader isn't being a hypocrite. It doesn't, because you're a leader doesn't mean you didn't make mistakes in the past. And you made mistakes, but you know what? You should have learned from them. And so what I always suggest to people in that situation is, if I've got a former peer who is cutting a corner, and they know I used to do it too. Well, now I say to them, you know what? You're right, Mike. I used to do that as well, but I was wrong then when I did it, and I'd be wrong now to allow it to continue to happen, because you know what? Right here in Oshkosh, we are trying to be better than what we used to be. We are trying to grow and become a better organization. And with that, we need to do things better. We can't continue to make the same old mistakes and normalize the deviance that we've normalized in the past. So join us, join me. Let's do this together. Let's improve things. Right. So having we talk about courage and humility being the cornerstones to our character, having the courage to have the conversation with a former peer, and then the humility to say, you know what, I used to do that too. So that's the first tier of that. The second tier is now, how do you support that, maybe that company officer or the battalion chief in that situation, and build that. Well, one of the things is I keep bringing up these kitchen table conversations. The first times, it's amazing, across the entire country, that is the most common leadership challenge I hear. Well, now I'm leading somebody who used to be my friend, or I want them to still be my friend. And everybody's encountering this about across the country, but why aren't we talking about this before somebody gets into leadership? Imagine one of those kitchen table conversations where somebody leads a conversation and says, guys, in the next 6 months to a year, it's a pretty good possibility that one of us is no longer going to be at this table right now because they got promoted. Now, if Anderson over there gets promoted, what are we going to do? What are we going to do for the people right now that we say are our friends and our colleagues, and one of us gets promoted, and that means the other ones don't? How are we going to support them? Are we going to do this whole thing like, well, you're one of them now, I guess, oh, look at him, got the bugle. Or are we going to sit there and help them try to be as successful as they could possibly be? If you are the one who gets promoted, would you want these people around this table to support you? Or would you want them to be talking about you behind your back? So let's talk about this before we even get there. Let's prepare our people before they get promoted. And let's prepare the people who aren't promoted to support the people who are promoted, even if I feel I was probably the most qualified, or I have more tenure, or whatever other Eeyore type things that people complain about when they don't get a promotion. What am I going to do to support that person? So that setting up, having those conversations before those situations happen, I think is critical for us to support those newly promoted people. And then as an organization, again, it goes back to how do we, when we have a big issue that hits the news that we've got to go back to our firefighters and talk to them about it because we've screwed up or something has screwed up. Having, again, a leader who has the humility to recognize the fact that I'm not perfect, I screwed something up, and be able to say to the entire, whatever rank people are, and standing in front of them saying, I messed up. I hope you guys will give me the benefit of the doubt. That was not my intention, but hey, I screwed this up. Help me get better, right? And having that humility to just bite the bullet and admit the mistake. Most people don't expect perfection from their leaders. And I think as leaders, me too, I used to think admitting a mistake showed some sort of flaw in me, and it might actually people might not want to follow me because I made a mistake. And actually, what it did was, and what it does is, people tend to trust people who are willing to admit when they didn't do something well. And so that's the way I look at it, especially when we come from that courage and humility aspect.
It's always my favorite thing to do on these is to give people some takeaways. And I think those are some excellent takeaways that, as you were talking, even though I had my camera off and you couldn't see me, I was nodding my head and writing things down going, brilliant. I love that strategy. Really appreciate you sharing that strategy about, hey, one of us might get promoted. What does that look like in the future? I've never heard that before, never thought of that before. And I want to circle back to your conversation about were we trained, to do interviews, and how do we do them differently? I want to give the audience one more takeaway, as we're wrapping up here. That, like you said, maybe interviewing isn't my bag. Never done it before, never had the opportunity, or I get little input. What's the one question as a fire chief that I need to be insisting that gets asked to help me figure out if somebody's a leader or character? Give me a pearl.
Wow, one question. Okay, one question. That's hard. But I think I'm going to go back to the idea when I said, most leadership failures are character failures. But when you look at most character failures go back to one of two issues: fear or pride. Think about that. When we have regrets in our lives and we didn't do the right, we made a poor choice and we look backwards, we usually go look backwards and say, if you dig deep, you'll recognize there's fear or pride somewhere inside that, the reason for you making that poor decision. So if I'm going to ask one question to somebody as we're looking at them to promote them and try to figure out, are they a leader of character that we want in our agency? I'm going to ask a question around courage or humility. And probably, I have a framework for interviewing around these 6 habits of character. And if we just focus on courage right now, and I say, if I'm going to ask a question about courage, what I'm looking for is, did they step up or speak up in a difficult situation? All right. How many times have we seen lots of big, bold people? And well, let's say this. It amazes me in the fire services that I meet men and women who are willing to run into a burning building or put their head inside a car that's on fire to try to unhook a seatbelt when a woman is trapped in a car. Yet, when it comes to having a difficult conversation with somebody, it's like, "Ooh, I can't do that. That's too hard to do." I mean, it's amazing to me. But too many leaders being unwilling to have difficult conversations with former peers or with supervisors or whatever. I'd ask a question like, tell me about the toughest conversation you've ever had with a peer. And I'd sit back and listen. Right? Tell me about the toughest conversation you ever had with a peer. Notice that wasn't a philosophical question. Notice that it was about what they actually did. Right? I want to hear what they actually did. And I'm going to give you an acronym, STAR, STAR, situation, task, action, result. What was the situation that they were in? What task did they have in front of them? What action did they take? And what were the results of those actions? If they can answer that question about the toughest conversation they ever had with a peer, and a lot of people tell you the situation. Some people might tell you about the task that they had at hand. Some might even tell you about their actions. But boy, if they don't tell you about the results, what were the results of that conversation? Be careful, because you're not going to be promoting a results-oriented person, right? So situation, task, action, result. Ask a question that's specifically about what did they do, not their philosophy, but what did they actually do when they're faced with a situation? Because if we figure out what their behaviors were in the past, we're probably going to know what their behaviors are going to be in the future. At least it's a better predictor than those philosophical questions.
That is an absolute gem of a takeaway, my friend. That I think it's been great what you've been able to share with us so far. But we really have just hit the tip of the waves on a very in-depth conversation. So always leave them wanting more. Is one philosophy. Well, if I want more, where do I find it?
Sure. There's a slide in front of everybody right now with a QR code. Some people want to know, hey, Dave's talked about these 6 habits of character. How do I know where I stand right now? Well, use that QR code right in front of you, or go to www.mycharactertest.com. Download this character test. It's free. It's private. We do not collect the data. We don't know who's answering these questions at all. Okay. So it's going to take you 5 minutes, and you're going to answer 18 questions, and you're going to get a score on each one of these habits of character. Now, be honest with yourself, or else it's a worthless assessment, right? But if you're honest with yourself, at least you're going to get some understanding of where your character is right now. And I want to assure you, none of us have perfect character. We all have room to grow. So if you come out with top scores in all 6 of those habits of character, spend a little extra time on humility, okay? But we all got room to grow here. So use this character test and to just give yourself a snapshot, a look in the mirror where you are today, and maybe it'll give you something to work on. On the next slide, I'd like you all to see that. One more back, please. Yeah, so we do these firefighters of character workshops. Yeah, right there. 3-day workshops. This is where I'm going to be in San Mateo, California, on November 18th through the 20th, running a 3-day workshop. becoming a firefighter of character, which we talk about, spend a lot of time on the 6 habits of character. On day 2, we're going to be talking about communicating with character, and everybody gets a personality assessment. We're going to talk about how do you handle tough conversations with peers, like we've kind of touched on. And on day 3, we're going to talk about becoming a team of character. How do we build the organization's character, whether or not we're leading an entire department or whether or not we are leading an engine company or wherever we are? How do we build that culture of character, that organizational character? So that is an outline of our 3-day workshops. And on the next slide, you can see one more back. Right there. Perfect. Thank you. This is just an example of a training plan that we've done with organizations. And you can see we do these live workshops, but we also have a train the trainer program where we can help scale these messages out to larger organizations and help certify some people inside your organizations to lead these firefighter of character workshops. And then what you see is a book in front of you called Becoming a Firefighter of Character. And that's 6 months of character development and training for firefighters. And there's 6 habits of character, and there's a month's worth of short readings and case studies based on firefighters and working with firefighters. And imagine an organization that decides, hey, October is Courage Month, and then November is Humility Month. And these conversations happening around the kitchen table across the entire organization, and how that could impact the culture, and even preparing people for promotion, as we've been talking about here. How do we get that down to the people? And the whole idea behind this stuff is me showing this to you is we don't just want to come in and do sugar high keynote addresses and walk out and be done with organizations. We want to not only inspire leaders, but we also want to equip them so that they become leaders of character who inspire and equip others to lead with character. And so we want the leadership in your organizations to be prepared to then have these conversations themselves without a guy like Dave Anderson having to come in and do that for you. Because remember, training is an event and development is a process. And on this last slide, I just want to share with you, if you want to get in contact with us, whether or not it's for doing keynotes, at association meetings, or in this, the picture there is me when I was working with CAL FIRE, or these 1, 2, or 3 day workshops, or train the trainer, or online courses. Our contact information is right there on the slide. info@alslead.com. There's our phone number on the slide. You can join our LinkedIn group called Firefighters of Character, or you can go to our firefightersofcharacter.com website and see more about what we do. But I love what I get to do with firefighters. I love firefighters. I love to get to eat dinner with firefighters when I'm out there working. Long Beach is going to feed me. And Madison, Wisconsin made sure I was well fed when I was up there for the football game last week. So this is one of my favorite things I get to do, is work with folks like you. So, Chief, I appreciate the invitation for being here.
Dave, I can't thank you enough, my friend, for taking the time to share your experience and your knowledge and your wisdom with us. I know I got a tremendous amount of value out of it, was writing notes fast and furious. And as you were bringing up those different great takeaways, so on behalf of myself and the Great Lakes Division and the IAFC, thank you so much for what you're doing.
Yes, sir.
To help develop leaders of character in the fire service.
Yes, sir.
For all of you that joined us today or are listening to the recording, thank you for taking the time to learn and grow with us today. That until we have our next opportunity, keep leading, keep them safe, and thank you very much. Take care now.
Thank you.